But it is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Ragan Petrie. So there's a few key things that everyone should know about Professor Petrie. The first is that she's an amazing research powerhouse. She uses a mixture of lab and field experiments, which of course makes her the perfect person to give a plenary at an ESA conference. She is at the forefront of experimental methodology, recently working on some experiments with children at the age of 3. If you think it's hard to get university students to follow incentive compatible instructions, I can't even imagine what it would be like to do with somebody at the age of 3. Furthermore, in those papers, she follows those subjects for 7 years, which is amazing because she's really pushing the boundaries on how we're doing data collection. So essentially, I think she is modeling what many of us view as the ideal, the use of innovative experimental methods to ask important questions with broad impact inside and outside of the academy. So now that we've established that she's a research powerhouse, let me move on to how she's obtained this elite status. Ragan and I share an academic lineage. We both have Jim Andreoni as our advisor. And although I feel very lucky to have had Ragan as my academic sibling, I have to admit that she may have put the bar a little too high for Jim's expectations of his PhD students. For example, Ragan ran lab experimental sessions on the day of her wedding. A story that Jim told me on many occasions, but most of which right before he asked me to run sessions on a weekend or late at night. And then last but not least, let me praise Professor Petrie for the way that she contributes to the public good. Her research agenda asks important questions about things like reducing recidivism and closing the gender wage gap. Professionally, she is an editor of our flagship journal, the ESA. But I think really it's in the unofficial work that she does that it's so important that what she's doing is contributing so much. For instance, when I was a PhD student, Ragan would always make sure to ask me to go to dinner when I went to a conference with her. And that was really meant so much because I didn't know anyone. And it was nice to have someone to go to dinner with. And then furthermore, she would shepherd me through all the weird social situations that somebody is going through when they are a PhD student. And she'd always make sure to tell me when she was planning to leave. And if she asked me if I needed to have, if she wanted me to walk back to the hotel with her, but not in a weird mom way, in a really just supportive way of making sure that I felt safe and welcome here. And so I think these seemingly little things, these gestures that she makes are part of the reason that I wanted to be part of the ESA and why others are probably still here today. She makes this place a place where all of us feel we are welcome to contribute our ideas and our innovations. So without anything more, I would like to hope that all of us will join in thanking her for her hard work and listening to her wonderful plenary. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Laura. That's very, I'm embarrassed, but also very flattered. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for being here. Questions are going to be delayed till the end. So I'm just going to move forward and give the talk and then leave time at the end to field questions. So let me see here. Okay, so as anybody in the charitable giving sector knows, you should always lead with gratitude. And so that's what I'm going to do. And first, I'd like to thank the ESA Conference Organizing Committee for inviting me to give a talk. Very much appreciate that. Also, I want to acknowledge my research partners in the projects that I'll be presenting. One is the Coleman Foundation, and also many, many charities in Chicago who have given their time and their data for these projects. What I'm going to present is based on a joint work with Marco Castillo, a colleague, called Optimal Incentives to Give. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of details of that project, but present sort of the main things. So feel free to look at that. And then a new field study that we ran last fall. So just to motivate a bit here, nonprofits provide very important public goods, especially in the United States. There are about 1.5 million nonprofits, representing about 5.6% of GDP and about 10% of private sector employment. Yet, despite their importance, about a third of them don't make it to 10 years. It's about half in the case of for-profit firms, and about 7% are estimated to be technically insolvent. Now, charities receive government grants yet about 72% of their revenue comes from individual donations. And they spend about 20 cents per dollar raised on fundraising. So
Ragan?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to be on your title slide still?
No, is that what you're seeing?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try this. Okay, I think I have to do it here.
Yeah, that worked.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. I was doing full screening, it wasn't moving. All right, so charities receive government grants, yet about 72% of the revenue comes from individual donations. And they spend about 20 cents per dollar on fundraising. But their survival is going to depend a lot on their ability to fundraise. So what I'm going to present in the talk is about prices of giving, and charities often reduce the price of giving by matching donations. And there are two questions I'm going to be addressing. First is, what do optimal incentives to give actually look like? And then, do charities know how to set matches to maximize fundraising? So usually what charities do is they offer this dollar for dollar type match. So that is, every dollar that's donated gets matched by another dollar. So this effectively lowers the price of giving to a half. But this can be inefficient, especially if the price elasticity of giving is less than 1, which has been found in many studies. So what can happen is the donor can reduce out-of-pocket donations, even though the money received by the charity actually increases. So the charity might actually be better off just announcing a large donation and not reducing the price of giving. So it's not clear that these one-to-one matches are actually efficient from a charity point of view. So what's the design problem for the charities? So charities can have different kinds of objectives. They may care about maximizing out-of-pocket donations. They may care about attracting new donors, increasing donor retention or participation. And the charity, we're assuming the charity is going to choose an incentive that's meeting an objective and accounts for donor preferences. So the way we model this is we assume quasi-linear preferences over donations and consumption, and some sort of propensity to donate in the population. You can think of this as like the donor base. So what is the charity's donor base? And an elasticity of giving. So how responsive are donors to changes in prices? So we derive what's an optimal fundraising scheme, assuming that individuals respond to marginal pricing and demand is inelastic. In this case, the optimal incentive is not the popular one-to-one match that many charities use. The optimal fundraising scheme is one that should have a threshold so that only donations above a certain amount of money would be matched, which implies that smaller donors would not be given this price reduction. And then the optimal threshold would be one where there's an increasing discount for large donors. So it's nonlinear above the threshold. So the intuition here is that excluding small donors forces them to raise their donations to be able to get a match for the charity. And the nonlinear pricing increases higher donations. Now, donors may not respond to marginal prices, and there's a lot of evidence that people may respond to average prices. So this has been called schmeduling, or one could think of this like warm glow giving, where they're not responding so much to prices. So donors may underreact to price changes. So in this case, notches or some discontinuity in the budget set would actually help. And the intuition here is similar in the sense that you need to increase your donation to get to this notch. So again, it would be only donations above a certain threshold would be matched. And also because people are responding to average prices, the crowd out that might happen above the notch won't be as extreme. So with these notches in the budget set, these would handle people who might be responding to average prices, and it does no worse for those who respond to marginal prices. So a type of match incentive that would fit this characteristic is a threshold and a fixed match. So the kind of incentive scheme is something like donations of $100 or above are matched at $100. So to give some sort of an idea of how these thresholds might affect giving, what's on the screen here is on the x-axis are the donations that are actually received by the charity. And on the y-axis is consumption. So any donation would reduce consumption by the amount of the donation. The black line just represents the budget constraint that any individual would face if they were not faced with a match incentive. So a donation of $25 would reduce consumption by $25, and the charity would receive $25. Now consider a match incentive that's something along the following. So donations between $25 and $99 are matched at $25, and donations of $100 and above are matched at $100. So what this does to the budget constraint is the following. So any donation of less than $25, the individual would face the same budget constraint as without a match. But at $25, there's a fixed match of $25, which will give a discontinuity in the budget constraint, and the budget gets shifted out. And then anything between $25 and $100 is priced at 1. So there's no additional discount, because anything between $25 and $100 is matched at 25. And at $100, the match is matched at $100. So now there's another discontinuity where the budget shifts out, and then the budget constraint is parallel and the price is 1 for anything above $100. So this blue line here is representing the match incentive, a threshold match incentive with 2 thresholds and a fixed match that's equal to the threshold amount. So what does this mean in terms of giving? So here's an example of an individual who, absent the match, would be giving this amount. And then with the match, they would increase their out-of-pocket donation to $25 and hit this new budget constraint right on the kink. So that would be an example of such a match increasing out-of-pocket donations. Now, it could also be the case that matches, this type of match incentive could decrease out-of-pocket donation. So here's an example of someone who is giving this amount to the charity, absent the match. Now the match incentive is offered, and the out-of-pocket donation was this amount right here. Now the match incentive is being offered. They reduce their out-of-pocket donation to hit the threshold, which is at $100. So they reduce the out-of-pocket donation to $100. The amount of money the charity receives goes up, but the out-of-pocket donation goes down. Right? So what's this net effect of these threshold matches on out-of-pocket donations? Well, it depends a lot on the propensity to donate, or the donor base in the population, and also who's the indifferent donor. So when do people move their donations to meet these thresholds? So here is on the x-axis is the propensity to donate. So this would be what would the donor be willing to give in the absence of a match? And then on the y-axis is the donation. So absence of match, a donor would choose some point along the 45-degree line. Now, let's suppose that there was a match offer where donations of $100 or more are matched at $100. Now, anyone who would have given less than $35 without a match would continue to just give $35 or less than $35. But anyone who would have given between $35 and $100 decides to increase their donation to $100. And then anyone who would have given between $100 and $200 will decrease their donation to $100 because they know that they would be matched with $100. So the charity would get whatever their donation is plus the $100. And then anyone above who would have given above $200 reduces their donation by $100. Okay, because the match will cover that reduction, and they will still be giving the amount that they wanted to give before. So what happens? So if we look at the black line here, this is how out-of-pocket donations will change. So anyone who was giving below $35 doesn't change their donation. Anyone who is going to give between $35 and $100 increases their donation to $100. Anyone who is going to give between 100 and 200 decreases their donations to 100. And anyone who is going to give 200 or more just decreases their donation by $100 because it will be covered by the match. So these are out-of-pocket donations. And then the red line is how much is actually received by the charity, because anything that's at 100 or above gets matched by $100. So this would be the shift in the donations. Now, what's the net effect? So anyone who would have given between $35 and $100 has now raised their donation. So there's an increase in out-of-pocket donations that go to the charity. And then, but there are all the donors who would have given above $100 who've now reduced their donations because it will be matched. And so now this is the decrease in out-of-pocket donations. So while a threshold and fixed match incentive fits the characteristics of what would be an optimal incentive in the presence of donors who react to average prices or marginal prices, the net effect on out-of-pocket donations is ambiguous, and it really depends a lot on where the threshold ends up being set. Okay, so so what we do is we take this idea of these threshold incentives to the field and conduct a field experiment. And this is to answer this question of what incentives should charities offer to potential donors that lower the price of giving. So we partnered with a private foundation and 26 charities and contacted over 112,000 unique supporters of charities with an offer, a threshold match offer. There was over $500,000 that was raised out-of-pocket donations, about $250,000 spent in matches. That was out of 260,000 in potential matches, meaning that some charities actually were not able to collect all the potential match money that was available to them with these threshold matches. So in the field experiment, what we did was randomly assign about 8 different threshold match incentives to these supporters across charities. And this was during a fundraising campaign in November of 2017. The responses that we got from the threshold matches, the random assignment of these matches, we used that data to structurally estimate donor preferences and then simulate optimal thresholds. Those simulated optimal thresholds were then implemented in the field in 2018 and 2019, and to see how this actually affects donations. So here's an example email that was sent by one of the charities to give you an idea of how these threshold match incentives were actually conveyed to potential donors. So some of the charities actually struggled with the idea of conveying this idea of a threshold match. They find the one-to-one match is a very simple way of describing a price reduction to potential donors. But this is what we used in the field experiment. So the email says your donation will be matched. Thanks to a generous supporter, any donation of at least $50 between now and November 3rd will be matched. This particular charity will receive a $50 match if your donation is between $50 and $149. $150 match if your donation is between $150 and $499, and a $500 match if your donation is $500 or above. So this particular treatment had 3 thresholds, one at 50, one at 150, and one at 500. And then there were other thresholds that varied the first 2. There were other combinations of 3 thresholds that varied the first 2 thresholds, and then there was always a 500 or above threshold. So the responses from the field experiment then were used in these estimations of donor preferences, and then we simulated what would be the thresholds that would optimize, would maximize a charity's objective, depending on their objective. So what I'm showing here is we did simulations over what would be the optimal threshold if the goal of the charity was to maximize out-of-pocket donations. Also, if the charity wanted to maximize donor participation. In this case, we define that as maximizing the number of donors that increase their donations relative to previous years. So what's on the slide here is on the x-axis is the threshold. So we simulated this across all possible thresholds from 0 up to 6,000. And on the y-axis is the predicted out-of-pocket donations. The blue line, straight line here is the predicted donation absent a match. So without any kind of match, the prediction is that donors would be giving on average about $247. Right? Looking first at the blue line here, the blue line here is giving the predicted donation for a range of possible matches, thresholds, and the match is equal to that threshold. So starting from a low threshold, the predicted out-of-pocket donation is below the predicted out-of-pocket donation without a match. And it rises steeply, maxes at 1,875, and then starts to decline. So the optimal threshold that a charity should choose if they were to offer a threshold, one threshold, would be to set the threshold at $1,875. Right? If they wanted to maximize donor participation, they should set the threshold at 175. Now note the predictions that we have from the model, it's pretty flat over a pretty broad range. So within 1.5% of the maximized out-of-pocket donation, a charity could set a threshold between 1,000 and 2,800. So the takeaway from this is that really what charities should be doing are targeting large, not small donors. And again, this is counter to what a lot of charities are doing, first with doing these one-to-one matches, and then also it's excluding small donors and really just saying if you give $1,875 or more, you'll get your donation will be matched. So the next thing is what is the best way to spend a match dollar? So we take the simulations and then we go through and say what would happen under various scenarios in terms of the predicted out-of-pocket donation and the match money that would be spent. Right? So on the x-axis here are various scenarios that I'll walk through, and the dark blue is the predicted out-of-pocket donation, and the light blue would be the match money that would come in. So as a baseline, if no match was being offered and there was a direct transfer of the match money, the predicted out-of-pocket donation would be about $250. Now, if we take the predicted optimal threshold, if the charity were to just set one threshold, which would be at the 1,875, or another scenario might be that the charity could offer two thresholds. Well, the second threshold in our simulations is actually higher than 1,875. But what's shown here is the predicted out-of-pocket donations if the charity were to choose one threshold or the charity were to choose two thresholds. So note here that what happens is the predicted out-of-pocket donations at these optimal 1 and 2 thresholds are higher than with no match plus a direct transfer. So the predicted out-of-pocket donations is about 12% higher when a charity is using this optimal threshold. And the match money is very similar across the two. So having two thresholds increases out-of-pocket donations very slightly, and the match money goes up slightly. The next scenario to look at is we say, okay, well, what if you were to take the same fundraising match money and then find the linear match that would produce that match, or that would produce an out-of-pocket donation such that it would cost the same in terms of the match money. That linear match would be about 50 cents to $1, and the predicted out-of-pocket donations are actually lower than not having a match at all. So moving from the same cost for a charity in terms of fundraising by going to a linear match produces out-of-pocket donations that are worse than no match at all. And then finally, the last scenario is one of the treatments that we actually used in the field experiment, which was a $25, $100, and $500 threshold. And that actually does worse than everything else. So the predicted out-of-pocket donations in that are even lower than no match and lower than the linear match. So this is a cautionary note that these threshold match incentives that we used in the field experiment were our best guesses, and also based on conversations with fundraising professionals, actually did worse than no match at all. And in it's because, as we find from the simulations, that actually these thresholds need to be set far, far higher than anything that we did in the field experiment. So the last thing here is we then took these two predictions from our model, which the threshold that would maximize out-of-pocket donations and the threshold that would maximize donor participation. And then for 2 years, these two thresholds were offered as options to charities that were participating in subsequent fundraising campaigns. And this was done in 2018 and 2019. And this was not a field experiment, it was an implementation. So the charity got to choose which of the two they wanted to implement, but they were required to implement that to have the match money. Now, the prediction of this is that the higher threshold would yield higher donations. So because we have 2 years of the same charities picking these, we can use a difference in difference model to actually see the effect of the higher threshold on out-of-pocket donations. So this is the difference in difference regression, and the first 2 columns here are showing the effect of the high threshold on donations, and the last 2 columns are showing the effect of the threshold on the number of donors. So the column 1 uses data at the charity level, and column 2 uses individual level donations. So we don't have individual level donations for all the charities, but we do have total donations for all the charities. Now we've eliminated small charities here, but what you can see is that using the data from total donations from the charities, choosing the high threshold increases average donations by 45%. Using individual level data, the effect is smaller. It's 5.5%. But here we can control for large donations. So the stronger result, the more robust result, I would say, is column 2. So this is saying that charities that chose this higher threshold were able to raise 5.5% more donations than those that did not. And there were 11 charities that switched between the high and the low threshold across these 2 years. And there's no significant effect on the number of donors. So this high threshold does increase average out-of-pocket donations, but it doesn't affect the number of donors that are making donations. All right, so just to summarize for this, linear matches do no worse than no match at all, but you can pick if the threshold match is placed correctly, meaning in this simulation that it's placed very high, it actually can increase donations. All right, so the next step in this investigation is to try to understand if charities know how to choose incentives to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So this is a field study on advice. So the previous field experiment shows that the best way of reducing the price of giving is actually to set threshold matches, not use these one-to-one matches, and that these threshold matches need to be set quite high to actually increase out-of-pocket donations. And indeed, charities that use these high matches that are predicted by the model increase their out-of-pocket donations. So this next study I'd like to present to you is about understanding if charities actually understand how to choose these incentives if they actually hope to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So this is a field study. It's not an experiment. And this is really about revealed knowledge by the charities. And this is kind of a proof of concept as a way of understanding what rules charities might be. First, if they understand where they should be setting these incentives to maximize out-of-pocket donations, and then also how advice might affect what they end up doing. So again, we partnered with this private foundation and 90 charities last fall, and over 500,000 unique donors were, or supporters were contacted. There were about 20,000 donors. About 6.5 million was raised in out-of-pocket donations, and almost $900,000 was spent in matches out of 1.1 million in potential matches. And again, this is a reflection of the fact that some of the charities, so there was a match cap for each of the charities, and some of the charities actually didn't hit the match cap. They didn't raise enough to actually do this. So this is also perhaps a little bit of a reflection of the fact that some of these charities may not be setting their thresholds high enough. So in the field study, in the first stage, we asked charities to choose a threshold. So in this particular study, it was not that the charities had to choose between two thresholds. Here, this was a free parameter. So they could choose to set a threshold at any level they so chose. There was a match cap of $12,500. And also in the first stage, we asked charities various information about what their objectives were in this fundraising campaign. We also asked them information about their previous donations from 2019. And we asked this in bin data. And the reason for this was, this is also along the lines of trying to understand if we can get course data on charities' donations, if we can then sort of back out their behavior rules and also estimate what would be the place where they should optimally set their thresholds under this regime where they had to choose a threshold, and the match would be equal to whatever the threshold was. So that's stage one. Then in stage two, after the charities had committed to a threshold, in a surprise, we offered guidance on where to put the thresholds. So the charity could choose whether or not they wanted advice, and they provided us with 2 years of previous donation data at an individual level so that we could tailor the advice to the particular charity. So we provided advice to the charity, and then those who asked for advice submitted a final threshold, and the non-advice takers were committed to the stage one choice. And then in stage three, we received individual donation data, anonymized donation data from 78 of the 90 charities. So a little over half of the charities asked for advice. And the advice takers and the non-advice takers are balanced on almost all observables that we have from the stage one data collection that we did. That includes their initial threshold. So there's no difference either in the mean or in the distribution in terms of the initial threshold between those who asked for advice and those who did not ask for advice. The difference between the advice takers and the non-advice takers is that advice takers do have higher donations. So their distribution of donations from 2019 tend to be higher than the non-advice takers. This is the distribution of the initial thresholds that were chosen by all the charities. So this is pooling both those who asked for advice and those who did not ask for advice. And as you can see, there are about 43% of charities that chose either 175 or 1250. So this is likely a holdover from previous years where they had to choose between the two of them. But there are charities who chose things, at least initially, in between. So there's almost 12% that chose a threshold of $100, 10% who chose a threshold of 500, and one charity who chose a threshold of $5,000. Right? So this is a slide that shows the advice that we ended up giving to the charities. So this is the advice that was given to charity number 17. On the bottom part of the panel here, in this box, is the distribution of donations from 2019 for this particular charity. And they're binned from $0 to $24, $25 to $49, and so on. So the thing to take away from this is that this particular charity does have some high donors from previous years. So some that gave in the $1,250 to $2,500 range, some that gave $5,000. Then above that is the picture of the advice that we gave to the charities. So what this is along the x-axis are a range of possible thresholds. And the y-axis is the predicted amount of fundraising dollars raised. That's not only out-of-pocket donations, but also matches. So what this is giving a charity is what is the predicted amount of fundraising dollars for a full range of possible thresholds that they could choose. Now the red line here is what is the predicted amount of fundraising absent the match. So without the match, how much did we predict that they would raise? The bold-faced black line here is the prediction of the amount of fundraising dollars if the charity were to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So this is maximized at a threshold of $2,450. And so the blue line right here, this is the threshold that the charity chose. The charity chose a threshold of $1,250. The recommended threshold, if the charity wanted to maximize out-of-pocket donations, is strategy B, this black line right here. And then the strategy A, which is if the charity wanted to maximize donor participation, would be to set the threshold at 225. Now, again, and then the gray lines around here are confidence intervals around it. Okay. So this is the advice that was given to this particular charity. So the charity received this. They had about 5 days or so to make their final decision, and they submitted what they wanted to choose as their final threshold. This is the distribution of initial thresholds, advice given, both if they wanted to maximize out-of-pocket donations, and then also if they wanted to maximize donor participations for those who asked for advice. So on the x-axis here are the thresholds, and this is the cumulative distribution function. The gray line is what these advice takers chose initially. The orange is the advice, the distribution of advice if the charities wanted to maximize out-of-pocket donations. And the blue is the distribution of thresholds if the charity wanted to maximize donor participation. So the thing to take away from this is how much larger the recommendations of thresholds are compared to what the charities chose initially. So charities are choosing thresholds that are lower than the advice if their objective was to maximize out-of-pocket donations. And we asked the charities in the stage 1 survey what their objectives were to rank objectives for this upcoming fundraising campaign. And 69% ranked either as number 1 or number 2 that they wanted to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So that particular objective seems to be present in mind in many of these charities. Now the people who were given advice could revise their thresholds if they so chose. And what this graph is showing is, again, on the x-axis are the thresholds, and this is the cumulative distribution function of the final thresholds that the charities chose. And this is for those who asked for advice and those who did not ask for advice. So of the advice takers, 61% kept the same threshold for their final threshold. So they didn't change their initial and final threshold at all. 33% raised their threshold, And only one charity actually took our advice exactly. So the advice was to set a much, much higher threshold. Half of the charities got that advice. Only one actually took the exact advice, and 33% raised it a little bit. It is the case that the final thresholds for those who took advice are significantly higher than those who did not take advice. So we wanted to try to understand a bit more. So the charities have revealed, so we want to understand a little bit more what the charities are revealing in terms of their knowledge. So in this particular study, we fixed what would be an optimal threshold type and allowed them to choose, or the optimal incentive, and allowed them to choose the threshold. And we can see that the threshold that they're choosing is much lower than what should be set if they wanted to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So just as a way, a back of an envelope way of trying to back out what kind of rules the charities might be using, we do a back of an envelope calculation of some simple rule a charity might be using to think about where they would set a threshold when posed this question. So for these simple rules, we said, okay, we're going to assume that donors don't react to incentives, so they're not going to change their donations at all. So charities could use the distributions that they had in 2019, and we're just going to assess thresholds at $25 increments and just add up the amount of money the charity would raise in terms of out-of-pocket donations and the matches, and then choose the threshold that would maximize that. Maybe that's a rule that charities use. And then we're going to compare that to what the researcher would give, so what we would give as advice. And we use the bin data from all 90 of the charities and estimate what would be the optimal threshold. And now this is not using the full model that we used for those who asked for advice. And the thresholds tend to be a little bit higher, about $96 higher. So this picture shows, again, the cumulative distribution function of the thresholds for, so the gray is again the initial threshold. This is for all 90 charities who participated in the study. The orange is what the researcher would predict should be chosen as a threshold. And the green is what would be chosen if charities were using that simple rule where they think that donors don't react to price incentives, and the bin data that they had in 2019 is exactly what people would end up doing. When we run a regression of initial threshold on this simple rule, so the predicted threshold from this simple rule and the predicted threshold from the advice, these are the coefficients that we get. And the simple rule explains a larger share of the initial threshold than the researcher advice. And indeed, you can see this here, that even the eyeballing it, the simple rule, the distributions of those are much closer to what the charities initially chose than what the researcher would actually suggest. Now, donations raised, so we don't have complete data on the donations raised, and 2020 turned out to be an extremely generous year. For whatever reason, or there's a lot of COVID savings from people not spending money that they spend in donating. Donations were 18% higher than the previous 2 years, and it swamped any effects from these higher thresholds that charities might have chosen. So from the advice field study, even restricting the charities to choose a threshold fixed match incentive, there's still a large gap between the choice that charities choose and this researcher-derived threshold to maximize out-of-pocket donations. So circling back to the title of the talk, which was, do charities actually know what triggers donations? Well, it's complicated. It certainly seems to be the case that, so looking out in the field, the status quo bias seems to be very strong. It's very hard to get charities to move and try to choose other kinds of matching incentive schemes. So these one-to-one matches are prevalent, and certainly through the course of doing these studies with the charities, they often find it very difficult to think about offering these threshold matches. It may be that charities really don't have a lot of opportunities to learn or to experiment. And indeed, good years may may lead to some sort of confirmation bias about what works, and they're not willing to try things out and try new types of schemes, or even conditioning on the scheme being what should be the best scheme, which is a threshold fixed match. They're not even choosing that threshold in a way that maximizes out-of-pocket donations. So it may very well be that charities are not aware of these better alternatives, and even if they are made aware, they're unwilling to try. So in the advice field study that we did, which was really this revealed knowledge, even giving them the instrument that would maximize out-of-pocket donations, very few of them wanted to know what that was, because everyone could have asked and they still could have kept their original threshold, and many of them did. But many of them were very unwilling to try these higher thresholds to actually increase their out-of-pocket donations. Thanks.
Laura, you should probably run the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much. I think we now have some time for questions and answers. So I will try to see if anyone can, you can either unmute yourself or raise a hand, and I can come look for raised hands in here.
I have a question.
Please go ahead, David.
I always have questions. Have you thought about or looked at all at the intertemporal effects in terms of if you get more donations at time t, what the effect is on time t+1? And also if you get more participation at time t, does that lead to more donations at time t+1?
Yeah, so so we know something about, so we don't have complete data on all these charities, and certainly the fixed effects or the difference in difference models that we've been running have sort of, differencing those things out. The tricky thing that goes on with a lot of these field studies is that you have to basically take out what the charity was doing the year before, because it's distorting a lot of these price incentives. So the advice, the tailored advice that we ended up giving to charities last fall, we had a lot of information about past incentives, which are kind of distorting how people are giving because they may be responding to linear matches or threshold matches. And then it makes it a little difficult to sort of give them a recommendation and learn. And I suspect, so if they have good years, it's hard because they, again, 2020 was a very good year. Donations went up a lot, but so they may also believe that whatever they ended up choosing was really great. So we were trying to put together a panel of these charities over time, and haven't quite managed to do that. We usually try to get some sort of historical data from them, and in all the studies that we've done, we control for some of this. So it's a long-winded answer to your question that it does seem to, but there are a lot of other things that are going on that can make it difficult to kind of tease out how these effects happen.
I have a question actually building off of what you were just saying, Ragan. This is more of a procedural question, but I feel like these are the questions that don't always get asked. How do you approach these charities, and how do you build trust with them? Like, how do you get them on board to do these field experiments?
Yeah, so good question. So so our partner, the Coleman Foundation, has been instrumental for making these partnerships and actually getting these charities willing to participate. So partners are tricky because a lot of times they have ideas of what they want to do, and so even like the last study, the field study with advice, we really wanted to randomize whether advice was being offered. And our partners said, no, we have to offer advice to everyone. So, but I think the key thing is when you have a partner who really wants to learn. So partners who are willing to learn are then willing to stick their neck out and make conditions. So we've been able to do these studies over the years because the Coleman Foundation has been willing to impose certain kinds of conditionalities on these matching grants. And I certainly could never have run any of these. I don't have over $1 million to spend on changing the price of giving for people. And the fact that I have a partner that is willing to use the money that they were going to spend anyway to try to learn something is really great. And always at the end of the day, the charities volunteer. And we get really high participation rate amongst their grantees, but they seem to appreciate and have learned, seem to have learned something over the years. But again, this past study, very few of them were willing to actually take any advice or actually change. So there's a lot of stickiness in what these charities end up doing.
Well, if anybody has any questions, I think you should feel free to unmute yourself or, come off video. I think all of us have gotten very good at waiting in silence in Zoom rooms in classrooms this year. So I'm sure all of us can muster through a couple more minutes to wait for those questions to come in. But I might have to pop out in a minute because I have another session I have to lead at 5 and I'd like to not be late to that one today. But I'm going to go off video and hear the last few questions if we can. And at least we can thank Ragan for her wonderful talk as well.
Okay.
So I have another question.
Sure.
Why, I don't know what the size of these charities are, but given the stakes, why don't they do sort of internal experimentation programs? And certainly like the big online vendors are experimenting on how best to present and market things all the time. If your lifeblood is raising money, why don't you experiment and try to figure it out?
Yeah, so so there are a lot of, a very good question. So I think there's a lot of risk aversion out there, and I think there's a lot of status quo bias, and a lot of them think, so when we offered this advice last year, I was on the phone with several charities after offering the advice, and many of them were just terrified, trying to think about changing their, all of a sudden they've gone from matching things one-to-one to say, only if you give above, $2,000 would we end up matching. They think they might alienate donors. Donors won't respond to this. So again, this is charities may have lots of different objectives that may be driving this. So I think their impression of experimentation is trying lots of things at once. So I've seen many of these charities say, oh, we're going to do a one-to-one match, and we're also going to have a threshold, and we're going to give sign-up bonuses and things like that. But and I think it's also because the vagrancies of the marketplace and sometimes they have these good years and they say, oh, this is what we're going to do. This has always worked in the past. We can't possibly. So that's part of the not trying things that might actually be better. And that's a bit of a problem. So I think there are quite a few businesses who are willing to try things, but I think it's usually larger businesses that have a lot of scope for trying out things. And this is what a lot of the field experiments have been with larger businesses that can do, that has a lot of volume, but smaller charities that may feel like, oh, I can't do this because I might alienate that one donor who's really important to me. I suspect that's a big reason why people don't end up trying things. Other questions? Feel free to speak up.
So, hi, Ragan, Jim Cox here. I have a question. Have you, what about, one could think that putting matching in place, changing the matching formula, and then possibly switching back or removing it could affect repeat donors in the sense that some donors may resent changes. They may have gotten used to certain matches. Have you done a longitudinal follow-up to see what happens after your experiment?
Yeah, so we don't, so you're thinking of particular donors. So the tricky thing there is we never know who the donors are. And the supporters, yeah, so these charities over the years have tried different things. So what seems to have happened, so they're getting support from the Coleman Foundation to try different things. We can control for, so good question. So we could control for what the charity had done previously, but I don't know, like from the 2017 experiment, those who were offered particular kinds of matches, I can't follow that particular donor to see if they're particular. So at the level of the charity, I could see something like this. The 2018 and 2019, they were only able to choose one of those two. This past year, they were able to, it was a free parameter. But some of these charities come in and out, so, and I don't have individual level data for some of the charities over time, so it's a little difficult to control for these. But your hypothesis is that they would, they might be upset because an incentive has changed. Is that so?
Yes, I mean, it's part of human behavior. We adjust to things the way we're used to seeing them. And if you have donors that have contributed in the past, and all of a sudden there's a new matching formula they're not familiar with, or perhaps they responded to a matching formula and became donors, and then that matching formula is changed. They might feel is taken away from them. So I would think a longitudinal follow-up might be important. I mean, the charities themselves would have records of who their donors are, right? So they could track it if you got them to cooperate with that.
Yes, so that would mean asking each of these charities to give their data, and yeah, that's a good question. We could ask them if at some point we were going to try to link data over time, because I believe the Coleman Foundation has this, but some of this access to data has been a little more restricted more recently. But yes, very good question. It would be nice to know from an individual donor how they're reacting to these changes, these price changes.
And you could perhaps follow up with a random sample of your charities, not necessarily all of them.
No, that's a good point.
But before we end, this is a really nice paper. I liked it a lot.
Oh, thanks so much, Jim. Appreciate it. Yeah. All right. So I'll just say thank you very much for attending. If anyone has any questions, you should feel free to send me an email. Another session starts in a minute. So, all right. Thanks so much.
Thank you for coming to ESA this year. I will hereby announce this is the end of the plenary talk. Thank you.
Thanks.